last week about essentially just kind of the basic structure of qualitative research. But today we're going to get into some specific theories as well. Just a couple of quick announcements. First of all, almost finished with them, so I'm sorry that it's taking me so long, but I'll have those posted for you guys by the end of the day today as far as grades go. But I'm nearly finished. So, but let's get rolling into these qualitative research theories and kind of expand a little bit on what we learned last week. So, give me just a second to share my screen here. All right, guys. So, qualitative research theories, right? So, ultimately, what we've been learning up to now, has really just kind of dealt with the basic structure of qualitative research, right? But what we really need to get into is we're going to get into three very specific theories today. We're going to do a very, very brief treatment of those theories. We're not going to do a deep dive by any means, because if we did, I mean, that's an entire course in notes, right? So ultimately, right, what we've been discussing up to this point is essentially just the generalized process of qualitative research, meaning, conducting interviews, achieving data saturation, which really is the main point, right, of any qualitative study, at least, in as far as, making sure that the data that we have is consistent, right? And then obviously ensuring that trustworthiness. And we talked about a few ways of ensuring that trustworthiness last time we met, through member checks, through triangulation as well. So those are a couple of ways that we can ensure that trustworthiness. But that normal process, right, of generating, qualitative research is referred to as essentially just generic qualitative research, right? However, if we really want to get into, studying specific experiences or themes, or maybe we have a very specific intent, right, in attempting to design a qualitative study, that is where we get into utilizing theories. So we're going to just briefly discuss three different theories today. And those are ethnography, phenomenology, and grounded theory. So first of all, let's get into ethnography, right? So ethnography is a qualitative approach that's rooted in anthropology, right? So that's actually where it came from. So anthropologists essentially initially developed this type of research based off observations of cultures and societies. So ethnography attempts to understand how groups create and negotiate meaning, right? How people develop relationships and how people create and institute policy. So really, kind of like we talked about, this is really, it's interested in essentially exploring and defining, specific societies and their structures, right? So if you can imagine, studying, maybe a tribe, potentially in a specific, remote area, maybe in Africa or, Asia or somewhere like that. These types of approaches would be used to essentially not only identify but help to define that population, right? So some things that might be interesting to a qualitative researcher using an ethnographic approach is there potentially a hierarchy in the society? Is there something that kind of defines who is essentially in charge, who is leading the society? What characteristics do they potentially value within a leader? Right, and even is there a clear hierarchy at all? And then ultimately, are there any rituals or practices that arise from formation of that culture? Right. So are there specific things that take place within that culture that maybe are considered rites of passage, or maybe define that culture as a whole? One way that we would typically apply this, and particularly within maybe athletic training or, maybe even physical therapy or healthcare as a whole, is essentially looking maybe at populations that maybe have very limited access to healthcare, and or maybe those that have a specific disease. What are the things within that culture that are potentially the most valued? And are there things there that could explain maybe why, or maybe a reason why not, or why people don't, seek care for certain conditions, right? So ultimately, what a lot of ethnographic researchers find is they have to spend significant amounts of time within these cultures to really kind of answer these questions. So an example of that, right? Everybody has heard of, or at least has heard of, Jane Goodall. So Jane Goodall is probably, although she's not necessarily, her work is not necessarily recognized as ethnographic research, it's actually what it was. So Jane Goodall, obviously, all of us are familiar with her work. with conservation and also her work with primate populations in Africa. And in order to understand those cultures, she developed a bond, obviously, with these animals, and did so via an ethnographic approach, right? Via a series of observations and attempting to understand that evolutionary dominance hierarchy that existed within that group of primates. Okay, so ultimately, what are the methods here, right? So obviously, due to the roots in anthropology, ethnographic methods are based on observation, right? So this is data resulting from observations that ultimately might include census data. But what if let's go back and use our Jane Goodall example, right? Let's say that, you know, in her work, right, she defined or essentially stated, excuse me, that she was, you know, observing a population of 50 gorillas, you know, or 50 primates, so to speak. And each one of those gorillas actually had a number, right? And so, you know, however she categorized that or cataloged that via a number or via a specific marker, each one of them was actually identified in some unique way, right? And so her process of keeping track of that population, right, and observing what happened within that population, that's called field observations, right? And field observations, generally speaking, are a solid part of any ethnographic study. And those are actually recorded and codified, much that our interview was last week in the example that we went through last week with concussion symptomatology, right? So a generalized rule with ethnographic methods is that we start by observing the population as it exists generally and making general observations about that population, and then working towards very specific observations about that population, right? So, okay, on to the next one, phenomenology, okay? And honestly, just a couple more slides here on this stuff, and this is pretty much going to be it for today, but phenomenology essentially you know, finds its roots in philosophy, and it's really interested in trying to define experience, right? The experience of a specific phenomenon, and it really attempts to draw out meaning, right? So if you remember the example that we walked through together last week with our 3 participants in our qualitative study that we looked at, right? That was a phenomenological approach, right? We attempted to kind of unearth the specific phenomenon or experience and root out the meaning, right, of that experience of a concussion, right? And so that's ultimately how that's applied actually in real life, right? So obviously wanting to define the essence of something for someone, right, based on what they perceive to be its fundamental nature. Now, this is actually really important. So bracketing, right? All of us, and remember, we talked about the qualitative research as a whole has an objective structure, right? It actually is scientific, right? There's this misconception that qualitative research is not scientific when in fact it is. So in order for a qualitative researcher to actually objectively continue to collect data, right, and make sure that that data is actually in and of itself free of bias, the qualitative researcher will actually utilize a process called bracketing. So what that is that the qualitative researcher will actually go in and they will list all of their preconceived biases about a topic, right, to essentially help them, right, essentially exclude those from their analysis of the study. And so that's one way that we attempt to control for that type of bias in this type of design. Okay. All right, and last but not least, right, guys, we've got a grounded theory approach. So grounded theory, ultimately what we are attempting to do with a grounded theory approach is follow a series of events that might be unique or might be happening within a culture for the first time, right? And we might try to develop a theory as to why certain things are happening. So, you know, grounded theory, first of all, you know, has to result in a theory. So a grounded theory approach that does not produce a specific theory as to why something is taking place is not a grounded theory approach, right? That might actually be a phenomenological approach, but it's not a grounded theory approach because we actually have to be able to express and delineate a theory as to why something is happening. Okay, so the way that we do that is we essentially attempt to identify or compare information on essentially similar incidents, right? And then in looking at those similar incidents, we attempted to find categories or subcategories, based on those incidents. And then based on that, we begin to delimit a theory, right? And then we begin to explain the theory. So one example that was given to kind of describe this, and this was actually very heavily used at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the late 80s and early 90s. And we didn't really know a lot about that disease, right? We were really attempting to study that. And so one of the ways that that clinicians and physicians went about attempting to study this disease, right? That we now, thank God, we've developed a cure, essentially really progressive treatment for. And is now something that doesn't impact quality of life like it did, right? Now, but having said that, they actually went in within these groups that had been infected and began to study the different symptoms that they were presenting with, right? And not only in doing that, they not only looked at not only the symptomatology and what they were developing, but also looked at medical records from different sources, right? And so they began to essentially piece together these chains of events. And what that led them to was to be able to describe the etiology of this disease, right? We didn't, at first we didn't really know much about where this was coming from, but we eventually used that information in studying not only the groups of participants, but also their specific pathologic features and symptoms to be able to define exactly what it was that they were presenting with, right? And that is actually how we began to essentially define and understand HIV and AIDS, right? So, but that is essentially a very basic introduction to a grounded theory approach and how that would essentially be applied. So, guys, that's pretty much it for today. I know it's a super brief lecture. I know it's kind of felt like the theme lately, and apologize for that, but I think that maybe that's a welcome for some of you guys. So anyway, that's pretty much it. Only a few more exams to go, and those grades will be posted on Moodle, so I'm almost done with those. Once again, my apologies for the delay there. So be looking for that. A couple things as we head into the end of the semester. As soon as the last exam is written, I will open that up for you guys. What I'm going to try to do for you as well is find a way where we can actually get you guys to come in and maybe do a little bit more active review for the last exam. I'll also get a bonus quiz posted for you as well. And we'll take that lowest quiz grade and add that to your lowest exam, or that quiz grade rather, and then add that to your lowest exam in the class as well for a little bit of a boost. So that's pretty much it. If you guys need anything or have questions, please let me know. All right, I appreciate you guys, and thanks for hanging in there with me, and I will talk to you guys on Thursday. If you need anything, just please holler at me, okay?
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. I have a question quick.
Hey, Jessica, what's up?
Nothing much. How are you?
Good. What's going on?
Good. I was just wondering if you could post the last couple of lecture slides up on Moodle.
Yes, absolutely. I actually have those. Sorry about that, but yes, they're in a
No, no worries. You're good.
I just got to get them up, so I'm sorry. But yes, I'll get those
Okay,
up.
cool. Sweet. Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good rest of
your day. You too. Wesley, need anything? Have a question?